and thank you for tuning into the STEM Mobile podcast. Today's special guest is Professor Paul Sparks. He is the director of the doctoral program in learning technologies at Pepperdine University, and I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the STEM Mobile podcast. I'm your host, Amir Hojeji, and today I'm here with the wonderful Dr. Sparks. How are you doing today, Dr. Sparks?
Very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, what inspired you to pursue this career?
Well, this career, I assume maybe you mean that teaching college. I run the technology programs at Pepperdine University. Um, and I'm not sure when I was your age that I had this in mind, although it's turned out very well. Um, I was inspired by stories of scientists making the world a better place for the whole world, that sort of thing, right? I think a lot of kids. So in stories of dinosaurs and figuring out medicines and blasting off into space, I was inspired by all of that, and I felt like I wanted to be a scientist. So I set off originally um, to do that, and along the way, I found that I've had probably multiple careers, and so I've enjoyed each one of them and learned a lot from each one. But the guiding principle has always been to try and make the world a better place using science and learning as much as we could about the world uh, to improve things. So that led me through at college. I was going to be a dentist at one point. Um, then I hit organic chemistry. This is maybe a lesson for your listeners. Sometimes things don't always work out how you plan, but if you keep your eyes open and keep that kind of that general dream alive, for me, organic chemistry was very difficult, and I did well in most of the rest of school, but uh, because I struggled, it kind of put me out of the running for a career in dentistry, but it opened up a career in learning technology. Computers were just happening. I decided, wow, there's got to be a better way to learn organic chemistry. And I went off in that direction. And that's been the rest of my career, learning technology.
That's amazing. A new and interesting way to tackle things. I like it.
Right.
So, why did you choose to get a PhD in this field?
Well, there again, it was kind of a mix of my interests, my abilities, and opportunities. I think that's my message for your listeners today is it's not always one thing. It's rare to find somebody that wanted to be a dentist and blasted all the way through and became a dentist without looking to one side or the other or testing out the waters in some other career. So for me, I didn't set out to do a PhD, a doctoral degree, um, but along the way, what I learned made me want to learn more, right? Every time I went to another class or had another degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, it just it let me know that there was so much more to learn. So I would say that while that wasn't my original goal, it became a goal as I went through college, and I wanted to learn as much as I could about learning technology, the brain, how we learn, and so the next logical pathway was to get a doctor's degree. I went to USC, and that took a half dozen years, and it turned out to be a very important part of my life. For the last 25 years, I've spent teaching college, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without the doctor's degree.
Truly inspiring to hear. Wow, that's impressive. And in this career that you are in, how do you find inspiration to pursue your research?
That's a great question. If I can make one last comment or a question about the last, a comment about the last question. When I got my doctor's degree, I was standing with my mentor, my chair for my dissertation, and I said to him, I really expected to feel smart, really smart at some point, having spent all this time and all this money on the doctoral degree. And he just smiled at me like, yeah, all right, at least you got the big point of education, right? Because there's always more to learn. So what inspires me uh, for keeps me inspired for my research. I think the challenge there, at least for me, has been there's so many things to study. And so I think that bright young people like yourself the main problem is not going to be, oh, yikes, what am I going to study? It's, oh, yikes, how am I going to limit the interesting things that are out there to explore, right? And so I've done a few things. We've helped out in countries with technology. Have helped students do that. I just got back from a trip to El Salvador, and in the past, we've helped out with technology projects in Nepal and the Fiji Islands, right, where people have very little technology. That has been one real interest of mine. Um, I think that the main thing there is to keep reading and try to stay up on, which is getting harder and harder to do. So the times when I feel least inspired are the times when I've gotten lazy and I'm not reading and paying attention, listening to podcasts, going to conferences. But the minute you start going to conferences, reading, you're going to run into so many interesting things that the only problem is going to be having some discipline around what you're going to actually study. And that's been my experience. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Oh, for sure it did.
Yeah.
Um, Wonderful backstory and inspiration on how you pursue your research. So, in general, why do you think education in STEM and learning about it can be beneficial to students, specifically college students?
That's what I'm trying to think of the quote. I think this was John Dewey who said, education is not the preparation for life, it is life itself. Right. And Mark Twain also, he said something similar. He said, I never let my education spoil my learning. I absolutely love that one, although it gets me in trouble with my old high school teacher friends. The STEM, I taught math for 4 years in high school. This was at Whittier High School. It was a lot of fun. And uh, the uh, the challenge there is I found for students was identity more than anything else, right? So I found that most students could actually do the math if they applied themselves, but more importantly, if they saw themselves as someone who could do math or saw themselves as a scientist. I talked to so many students who would kind of fade away from my class, or they were doing well and then they just stopped doing well. And I would talk to them, and in every case, it was they had gotten a new identity, right? They had joined up with the skateboarders, for example, or the punk rockers at the high school. This was a thing back in the 1980s. And they said, well, I just don't see how it's important in my life anymore. It wasn't about their ability to do it. It was about their interest and their identity. So I think kind of the key thing around STEM is it's doable for all, or maybe I should say most students. But the key is having an identity that says, hey, someday I want to be a scientist, or someday I want to I want to do something that pushes knowledge forward in the world. And in order to do that, I need to understand math and science, at least to a certain level. And when you jump in with that identity, then it becomes just something that needs to happen. It's not a big mountain that you got to climb. It's it's part of the terrain that you're going to live in for the rest of your life, and it only makes sense. The other thing that happens with identity is once you're not fighting it, you make friends with others who help you. Learning, it turns out, is very social, right? And it became obvious to me that a lot of the math learning happened between students, between recess and on the way home, right? Or they would help each other with homework and with projects, that sort of thing. So while teachers might think they they deliver all this knowledge to students, that their most important role is to create challenges, right? Uh, Problems for students to solve and goals to reach, and then given the right tools, students can easily do that. It's important for STEM related issues. These are classes that may seem a little bit harder, but in a strange sort of way, they're actually, in my mind, easier because these are things that are definable and have the same answers every time, as opposed to maybe psychology and history, which are a little harder to define, right? It's a little harder to understand what's happening in history than it is to understand what's happening with molecules and compounds. So I think it's actually easier route in school to do the sciences, the STEM, and I guess that would be my advice for anyone that feels like that's the direction for them. Then kind of immerse yourself in that community and in that identity, and as you do, it will be much easier, and you'll find it's going to be uh, opportunities will open for you in the outside world. It's almost cliche that people with a doctor's degree in philosophy are working in Starbucks, right? But folks who have picked up the science and the electronics and the biology are working in research labs and companies making a real difference. So that was my interest, and I pursued that, and I think it still works now in 2021.
I'm speechless. Just yeah, for sure. And it's interesting how STEM is also like very diverse. It's not just math or science, and you did touch up on that, which is good for the listeners to also note as well. And speaking of um, advice that you touched up on earlier, do you have any further advice for future generations who also want to pursue this major?
Um, yes, and another quick story, if you'll allow me.
Yeah, for sure.
One of my students, I'll mention the organization. He started a nonprofit. He wanted to help inner city kids you learn technology, and he started a thing called Urban Text. And so Urban Text brought kids together after school, taught them how to program, not just program computers, but to develop games. They've recently got into blockchain and cryptocurrencies, right? And some of these students are now building their own cryptocurrencies and after school at high school, which is pretty cool, right? And so I tell the story because this is STEM. This is math and programming, and we call it uh, program logic that you figure out, and you're able to program computers to do whatever you can imagine. So they've recently taken this idea, this nonprofit, to El Salvador, which is where the founder was originally from, and trying to boost the knowledge of the high school kids there, so that they can also kind of leapfrog and use that technology to make their worlds better. And it requires that knowledge, right? And in terms of your question was advice to young people. That's I have three sons, and I tell them, be wary of your dad's advice, uh, because part of it, when I taught high school, I and first got started teaching high school, I thought, boy, this is an important job. I'm imparting my knowledge to the young generation so that they can be successful. After a little more than a year, I realized, wow, no, this is really more like they're allowing me to tell stories about how it used to be, but they're blending that with creating a new reality, right? Technology is changing the world so quickly that I felt a bit honored that they would allow me to kind of participate in co-visioning the future. It's important to know what's gone before. It's also very important to be up to speed on what technology is happening. So my advice is to, over time, it takes a little while, figure out what you want. That number one would be figure out your general pathway, your idea of the perfect job and the opportunities that exist might not always match up completely, but over time they will. So get clear on the direction that you want to go and make yourself open to those possibilities so you can test them out, and it's either going to work or not. You're either going to like it or you don't. And the benefit is that you know that you've got to move on, or that you found the area that you really like. The next thing is to be very aware that learning and knowledge is not just in your mind anymore, right? This is a really important thing that I teach the students in the graduate school. It's very clear now that knowledge doesn't exist in a single human mind. It exists in all of our minds. There's a new learning theory out called connectionism, which basically says that learning is building your network and knowledge is the network. If, in other words, you don't have to reach inside your own brain to come up with all the answers you need. You can go out to the internet. It's almost like we have the medulla, the small part of the brain, the reptilian brain, and the cerebral cortex, which is outside of the brain, which allows us to build models of the world. And it's now almost like we've got a third layer of our brain, which is the internet, and we have access to all of that information as well. So the advice is keep your eyes wide open, kind of get a feel for where you want to go, and then just enjoy the ride. Be a part, and join communities, interact with lots of people, because that's where knowledge lives. It lives in communities now. It's no longer a function of just a single human brain. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Good.
And it's honestly good to live by and follow along because it only takes more time for the internet to expand and grow more to validify that piece of advice for sure.
Right, right.
Thank you for the wonderful listeners, and thank you to the wonderful Dr. Sparks for participating in today's episode. I hope it was useful, and we'll be back with more future episodes. Happy STEMing!
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Best of luck to all of you.
Thank you, you as well.